Okay, we'll get started here. The title of the presentation, as you can see, is Backyard Beekeeping. And this is a picture of myself and one of my sons here on one of our beehives. And we'll spend some time tonight explaining what you're seeing in this picture. So first, how we got started. We got started in about 2015, or about 5 years ago. We have I have two sons. At the time, they were probably closer to 5 and 2 or 3. And we thought it might be fun to have a couple of beehives in the backyard. We do enjoy gardening and being outdoors. So we thought this was something that would be interesting to learn about. And it kind of blossomed into a little bit more. So how did we start? And how I would recommend you starting if you're interested in getting into beehives is taking a beekeeping class. I was very fortunate to take a beekeeping class through the Wheaton Park District. At the time, we were living in LaGrange. And it was presented by a gentleman named Chuck Lawrence, who lives out in Aurora, Illinois. He's a very knowledgeable beekeeper and did a great job of explaining how to maintain and set up your beehives. There was also a beekeeper class that's put on through the Cook County Farm Bureau. And I'd assume there's something similar down in the Will County area. But I'd really recommend finding a beekeeping class if you're interested in starting a beehive that focuses on the fundamentals of a beehive and not so much on the fundamentals of the bee or the anatomy of the bee. Well, that's very interesting and potentially useful. It isn't necessarily useful if you're trying to start a beehive. And in the class that I took, I think it was a 6-week class. We met for 2 hours or so a night. One class was basically focused on what you need to buy. One class was, and when I say buy, in terms of bee suits and equipment. One class was focused on how to take care of the bees once you have them, and so on. So it was a nice step-by-step process, which came in very handy. And this is a picture of the first 2 beehives that we had. At the time, like I said, we were living in very urban LaGrange. We had a lot that was roughly 50 by 150 foot in size, so not that big. And we started with 2 beehives. Most people will recommend you start with either 1 or 2. We did 2, with the thought being that if one of the hives died, we wouldn't want to be left with 0 hives. So we were kind of hedging our bets when we started with 2. We'll explain what you're seeing in this picture on future slides. Want to advance it, Grant? So the first step is building the beehives. That picture you saw on the previous slide are constructed beehives. And you can buy beehives all pre-made. There's even some people in the Chicagoland area that sell them pre-made. The person that we bought our first pre-made beehive from was a gentleman named Chris Sod. He lives in Wayne, Illinois. And I'm forgetting the name of his company. It might be Honey Trails. But Google Chris Sod, Wayne, Illinois. And like I said, he sells all the different beehive woodenware if you're not interested in constructing it yourself. The other option, and as we acquired more beehives, is you can kind of build them yourselves, and that's what's being shown here. Here we are assembling the insides of the beehives, or the beehive frames. In this case, we purchased all of the what's called the woodenware pre-cut, and all that we have to do then is basically nail it together and also glue it together. And Grant's going to show you what an assembled frame looks like. And basically what it is, the perimeter is basically wood, and the middle is where the bees put their wax and put the stuff they make. This is called plasticell. So it's basically a piece of plastic molded into the outline of a hexagon, or what beehives or the bees make with the wax. The rest of the beehive, or the part you can actually see when you're looking at a beehive, is the outside of the hive. Again, you can buy those either assembled or unassembled. And then if they come unassembled, you just basically, you can take, they provide nails and you can assemble them. Or if you have some woodworking skills, and my father actually helped make some of these, you can actually make the exterior of the beehive yourself. He might say it's overly complicated, but I think anyone with any type of basic woodworking skills and a couple of saws can do that. Off the top of my head, there's a couple of different beehive supply companies that supply the beehive materials. One is Dadent, D-A-D-E-N-T. They're actually an Illinois company. I think their headquarters is in Hamilton, Illinois, up by the Mississippi River. They also have a store up in Wisconsin, just over the border, and I'm blanking on the name of the town, but you can again, you can Google that. Other companies are Better Bee. There's a whole slew of them. Again, you can Google beehive supplies, and they all ship the supplies. So Grant, why don't you advance the slide? Grant's going to take a second here to explain the different parts of the beehive.
Okay. There is the outer cover, which is pretty much it's the roof of the hive. And then there's the inner cover. That is in, we put stuff on it, like in, I think in the wind. Jay, when do we put the sugar?
Yeah, so the inner cover is inside the hive. You really can't see that. And it's kind of an insulating level. And we use that sometimes in the winter to put food or what's called sugar water, or basically food for the bees when there's not enough nectar and pollen out there for them.
Okay, and there are two supers. There is the extracting super, and well, when it's getting close to when we extract, we will put a divider in the middle, so then, and the queen has to stay on the bottom, so it only lays the eggs in the bottom, and it won't lay the eggs in the top, because we do not want eggs in the honey. And then the frames, well, on that it says wax combs, is this, and then that's where the bees put all the honey and eggs. And then at the bottom, that's where the bees come in to the hive.
Yes, and basically in a beehive, the lower box is where the bees live, and the upper boxes is where the bees put their honey or excess honey. So in the summertime, if you have very productive bees, you keep adding more supers or hive bodies to the top of the hive. And as Grant was saying, you want to restrict the queen to the lower parts, and that's where the queen lays their eggs. In the upper parts of the hive is where the bees put their honey. And if you look really close on the red and blue beehives, you'll see at the bottom of them a white strip. That's called a mouse guard. It has little holes in it that the bees can fly through, but it doesn't allow animals like mice or other rodents to get in there. And you use that in the spring and winter and maybe fall. In the summertime, when the beehive is at full strength and there's maybe upwards of 80,000 bees in there, most rodents don't want to take the chance of getting into the beehive. But in the winter, or maybe early summer or late fall, the number of bees in the hive declines, and they're not able to defend the hive as well. So you put that little piece on the front. Next slide. So here's a close-up of the hive. What you see in the bottom are what we call the brood chambers, where the bees lay their eggs and basically live. That blue thing in the middle is the inner cover. And right now we have two hive boxes on the top because we have basically a quart jar inside there with sugar water. This is early spring, so you put some sugar water in the beehive so they have some food to eat when there's not enough nectar and pollen being produced naturally. So how do you get the bees if you're starting your first year? In our case, we bought them. This is a picture, this is a Prius. I think there are 8 boxes of bees in there. Each box has about 10,000 bees. So right now there are about 80,000 bees in the back of this car. So don't get in an accident, I guess. You can purchase bees amazingly online, and they'll be shipped to you actually through the US Post Office. Or there are different people around you that basically buy these packages of bees and then sell them to local people. Again, I purchased these from a gentleman named Chris Sod, who lives in Wayne, Illinois. He buys basically a semi truck of these, maybe a couple thousand of these, and then sells them to people in the area. What you're seeing here is basically, like I said, 10,000 bees in each of those, and there's 1 queen bee. On to the next slide, Grant. And here's a picture of the queen inside that little cage. When the queen is shipped with the other bees, which are called workers, the queen bee hasn't been acclimated to the beehive yet. So they put the queen in this special queen cage because the bees, the worker bees, would view her as an intruder and would probably try to kill her. So they put the queen in a special cage, and that gives her time to acclimate with the worker bees. So after about a week or so, you can take the queen out of the cage, and the worker bees will accept the queen bee. Next slide. Grant, why don't you talk about the different types of bees?
Okay, there are different types of bees. The first one is the honeybee,
And that's in the, where's the honeybee, Grant, in the picture?
the top left. And then under that is the yellow jacket. And then in the top right is the bumblebee, and below that is the, I think that is carpenter bee. And then if you, from the yellow jacket and the honeybee, the difference is the honeybee is black with gold stripes. The stripes are more gold. And then on the yellow jacket, it is more or yellow than gold. And then the bumblebee, it's bigger than the honeybees. And then the carpenter bee is even bigger.
And the one thing about honeybees, when they sting you, they die. So they're not really interested in stinging you unless you're attacking their beehive. So typically, if you're out in your yard and you get stung, it's probably not by a honeybee. Honeybees typically only sting you if you're right next to their hive or trying to mess with their hive. Next slide. So here is us getting ready to install the beehives, or the bees inside a hive. So this would be spring here, probably about middle of April. And this video kind of shows us taking a box of bees that we purchased. The one challenge working with your sons, they're also the videographers, so.
Oh, I didn't take the video.
I apologize for the choppiness here, but we'll go to the next slide here. And here's a picture now of dumping the bees into the beehive. What you do is you put some empty frames in the beehive, and you take the box of bees and basically you shake them in there. And the first time you do this, it's a little bit unnerving, but after you do it once or twice, it's actually fairly simple. Another way to introduce bees into a new beehive is using what's called nucleus boxes or nuke boxes. In the previous page, we just purchased 10,000 bees and you dump them into an empty beehive. In those cardboard boxes on top of the beehives, there's actually kind of an existing colony that's already been formed. There's 5 beehive frames in there. And they're already laying eggs and they're already making honey and bringing in pollen. So some people think this is a quicker way to get a beehive established. So what you do in this case is you first put the nuke box on top of the beehive that you're planning to put them in. You let it sit there for a day or so. And then after a day, you put the frames that are inside the nuke box into your regular beehive. As you might know, bees have some type of kind of internal GPS or homing system that once they kind of know where their home is, they come back and forth to that same location. So in this case here, since these bees were already in a nuke box somewhere else, you want to spend a day or so and let them kind of get used to their new location, so that when you transfer them from the cardboard box to the main beehive, they are more settled. So once the bees are in the beehive in the spring, then you need to keep an eye on them. And there's probably different frequencies you can check the bees. Typically in the spring and early summer, we check our beehives once or every 2 weeks, or maybe once every other week, maybe is what I'm trying to say. And as the summer goes on, maybe into July and August, you can maybe check them even monthly. What you're looking for in the early season is to make sure that the queen is still there and the queen is laying eggs. Because as long as the queen is laying eggs, you probably have a healthy beehive. Sometimes the queen can be difficult to find, if not impossible, in the beehive. So as a proxy, if you see that there are eggs in the beehive, that basically means there's a queen in there, so that you're doing okay. More advanced beekeepers, which I'm definitely not one of, can look for diseases and items like that. That's a little higher level, but there are some basic diseases that probably even a novice beekeeper could identify. We're not going to get into that today, but I will briefly talk on one item. It's one of the diseases is called a Aurora Mite. It's not a disease. It's a non-native mite that has traveled to the Americas, and the local bees right now really don't have any defense against it. So as a beekeeper, you need to basically treat your beehive a couple times a year to knock down or kill off this mite. These mites will basically destroy a beehive or weaken enough that it can't survive. Again, this presentation really isn't set up to talk about that, and that's something you want to investigate. There are a number of different ways to control Varroa mites. We use something called formic acid or mite away strips, but there are different techniques out there to control mites. And then the big thing in the wintertime, you really do nothing. The bees will hibernate over the winter, and they basically cluster in the hives, inside the hive, and they eat the honey in there as their food, and they flap their wings to stay warm. So right now the hives are all covered in snow, and the bees are all just clustered inside there. And then once spring comes, they kind of uncluster and start doing their flying around again. So in theory, beehives can survive winter at 100%, but in practice here in the Midwest, I think anywhere between maybe 25 to 75% of beehives over winter, and that's basically what I've seen. Anywhere from maybe 25% of our hives up to 75 have survived. And for what it's worth, right now we had 12 beehives last summer. Like I said, we started with 2, and then every year we've grown by a couple, and last year we had 12. Next slide, Graham. So here's a picture of us looking in the beehives. You see we're wearing bee suits. Again, the more established and maybe hardcore beekeepers don't wear any bee suits. I think that's kind of crazy. But we wear our bee suits, and we still do tend to get stung from time to time. So you gotta be very careful when you wear your bee suits. The bees sometimes still find a way to sneak in, but if you're careful, you typically don't get stung. And what we're doing here is we're taking off the inner cover to look inside the beehive to see what's going on. And as I said, here's pictures of what the bee suits look like. You can buy them both in adult sizes and kid sizes. And there are many different types of bee suits out there, ranging from just the veil portion, or the portion that goes over your head, to full suits that basically are coveralls with a veil. Or you can get basically a jacket with a veil. I'm not really sure if one is better than the other. I probably would say if you're a beginner beekeeper, probably better to get more bee suit than less. Next slide. So here's another video of us checking the bees. What you can do to get the bees to calm down is put some smoke on them. I'm not sure exactly what the smoke does, but it basically calms them so that they're not as aggressive when you're messing with their hive. Here we're pulling out a frame of bees. In 1 second here, we will have the camera move up to actually the frame. Just be patient here. There we go. And as you can see, there's a lot of bees on there. And what I'm looking at right now is to see, do I see any eggs in there? There's also something called capped comb. It takes about, from once the egg is laid by the queen bee, it hatches or it becomes an adult bee in about 20 days. So when you're looking at the beehive, initially you can see the eggs there. They're there for the first 5 days or so. It looks like a small little kernel of rice. And after about 5 days, the bees put a protective coating on top of the beehive cell, and the bee grows in there. So again, if you see that protective coating, that gives you an indication that there's a queen in there who's laying eggs. And here's another picture of checking the beehives or the frames. What you do is you pull one frame out at a time. There's about 9 or 10 frames in each box. And you just look to a lot of bees hatching out to see what's going on. And like I might have overheard there, you can actually sometimes see the bees hatching. So on that frame there, there's basically, hold on 1 second, Brad. There's brood, which is the eggs and the baby bees before they've hatched. But there's also going to be some honey in there and some pollen in there. The bees use the honey and pollen for food for themselves, but they also use it for food for the bees, the baby bees. And here's another video, I think.
So you see it?
So here's a little bit of a close-up of the bees. You can see oh, there's a bee flying by the camera. You see that bucket right there, that's sugar water that you put in the beehives in the spring to give them some food. Here's a picture of a lot of bees in the beehive. Is there a video, Grant?
No.
Okay. Again, just you spend a lot of time in the spring looking into the hive, and there's going to be a lot of bees flying around. So after the springtime, maybe come early summer or late spring, you start putting more of these frames on there. Typically in the lower part of the hive where the bees put their eggs, you use deeper frames, which are about, I think, 9 or 9.5 inches deep. This is called a medium-sized frame, which I think is about 6 inches deep. And I think I might actually have the name an Illinois frame. And this is where the bees put their excess honey, or the honey that the beekeeper gets to take out and eat. And I really like this picture here because this is a really nice picture of what a frame looks like with honey in it. You can see at the bottom some honeycomb, and inside the honeycomb there's honey. But that white stuff is the capping that the bees put on top of the honey once it's basically ready to eat. The bees basically convert nectar, or the sugars in nectar, into honey. When the nectars come in, there's a lot of water in there. So the bees have to basically decrease the water content. And once the water content is decreased, they put a cap on it. And the bees are naturally able to decrease the water content down to a level where the honey will basically last indefinitely and won't spoil. If there's too much water in the honey, it will spoil. But honey that's been properly, I guess, desiccated will last indefinitely. Grant, do you have any facts on that?
I think they found honey in an Egyptian tomb and it was still edible.
Yeah, so thousands of years it will last if it's at the right moisture level. Next slide. So here's another nice picture, kind of looking at the beehives. Again, you're looking at for different things in here, whether it's honey or diseased bees or capped brood. And brood is the baby bees. And this is a nice close-up of a frame here. This is what's called a deep frame. On the upper part of the frame in the upper left and right-hand corner, that is where there's honey. And the bees have capped that. So there's honey underneath that white, basically capping. Just underneath that capping, you kind of see some darker cells. That's pollen. And that's pollen that the bees have collected. And basically pollen is the bees' protein source. And the honey is basically more like their carbohydrate source. So what the bees do is they mix the honey and the pollen, and then they put that as food for the baby bees when the baby bees are developing. And then kind of in the middle of the frame, that's what's called capped brood. And underneath, in each of those cells, under that capping, an egg was laid. And then after, like I said, about 5 days or so, the bees put a capping on it, which allows the egg to basically mature. And after about 18 to 20 days, depending on the type of bee, a baby bee will hatch out. There are 3 different types of bees. There's a queen bee. There's only ever one queen bee in a hive. There are worker bees, or the female bees, which make about 90 or 95% of the bees in the hive, and the rest are the drone bees or the male bees. The drone bees take, I think it's 24 days to hatch. I think the worker bees take about 21 days to hatch, and the queen bee, I think, takes a little bit less, about 18 days to hatch. It's kind of tough to make out here, but the drone bees are a little bit larger. So on some of the brood that looks like it's not as flat, it kind of sticks out a little more like a bullet type shape. That's where the drone bees were. It's kind of tough in this picture to discern the differences, but at the very bottom there, I think there are some drone bees. It's very obvious when you're looking at this in person. Next slide, Grant. And here's a real close-up of a frame that has just honey on it. The bees, like I said, put that white protective coating on the honey once it's reached the right moisture content. And then you can see the very bottom of the slide, there's a couple places they haven't covered yet. The bees, I think, must kind of check the honey from time to time, and when it's reached that right moisture content, they put the capping on there. And then these are the frames that we take off, and we'll talk about in a couple slides how you remove the honey from these. So this is just another picture of the beehive, looking inside it there. You know, the next slide, Grant. So once the bees have made their honey, if there's excess honey, you can take it off. Hold on a second here. Typically, if you have a hive that's performing well, you could start extracting honey as early as July. You never really want to extract honey that was made from using sugar water, because that won't have the flavor of that you want. And typically, you just put that sugar water on in the very early spring, and the bees just consume and eat that honey themselves that they make from that sugar water. But come about the end of May, plants will start producing nectar, and the bees will bring that back to the beehive, and that's the honey that you want to extract and use. So basically, roughly the month of June, the bees will start bringing nectar into the hive and start making honey. And then depending on how productive your beehive is, or how healthy it is, sometimes by early July, you will have honey that you can extract. A couple things to note there. When you have a new beehive, the bees have to spend a lot of time and energy first making wax to put on the frames. I think I've read it takes about 10 times as much energy to make a pound of wax as it does to make a pound of honey. So that first year, when you first start out, the bees spend a lot of time making wax. In subsequent years, or years 2 and beyond, if you can reuse the same frames, which you typically can, if there's already wax built up on the frames, the bees can go straight to making honey. So typically in years 2 and on, if you already have frames that have wax built up, that's when you start getting a lot more honey. So as a new beekeeper, you probably shouldn't really expect to have any honey you can extract the first year. Any honey that is produced, you typically want to leave in the beehives for the bees to use as food over the winter. And as a rough gauge, it's recommended to leave between 60 and 80 pounds of honey in the beehive for overwinter. And if you're interested, one beehive can produce an astronomical amount of honey in a year. Obviously, the minimum it can produce is 0, but some beehives can produce in the hundreds of pounds a year. I think one year we had a beehive that produced somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of honey just in 1 year. But I think some of the really good beekeepers in the area, if they have multiple hives or a lot of hives, I was just talking to a beekeeper the other day. I think he has about 20 hives, and I think he produced on average across those 20 hives 135 pounds a hive, which means obviously some produced a little more and some produced less. But that's a very good result. I think as a novice beekeeper, if you can produce anywhere between 20 to 50 pounds, you should be very happy. Like I said, we've been all over the board. Some years our hives will produce 100 pounds, and last year wasn't too good of a year. I think on average we had a couple that produced 0. So we produced maybe 20 to 30 pounds a hive. So it can really vary from year to year and what's going on. Yeah, in a good year, like I said, you can maybe get on average over 100 pounds of honey per hive. But that's not the norm. Don't be expecting to get that as for sure as a novice beekeeper. So then what you do is, like I said, you take the boxes that have the honey off, and we take these into our basement. We basically clean it up. We put a tarp down. We kind of sanitize everything. And then what you do is you put the frames of honey into basically a tank or a honey extractor. And the extractor spins around, and basically the honey is kind of spun out of the hives into this tub. Next slide. So what you see here is the honey coming out of the extractor. Maybe Grant, do you want to describe what we're seeing here?
Okay, this is where at the bottom of the extractor there is a valve where all the honey that came out of the frames comes down. We have this to get all the tiny bits of wax and dead bees out of the honey. And then when it goes into the bucket, it's a lot more pure.
So when you're producing your own honey, a lot of people don't like to pasteurize it or denature it. A lot of times the honey you buy in the store has been kind of pasteurized, obviously for preservation purposes. But I think some people think that kind of kills off some of the flavors or some of the health benefits in the honey. So when we basically bottle and produce our honey, all that we do is strain it. Like Grant said, we just strain it to kind of strain out the wax and bee parts and stuff that might be in the honey. You might notice it's a little bit cloudy here. When you're extracting it, the honey is a little cloudy, but once it has time to kind of settle, it becomes crystal clear or much purer looking. On to the next slide. So the process that we do is first you got to take the frames off the hives, and that's done by basically pulling these boxes off. Each frame has about 4 pounds of honey in it when it's completely full. And typically you have 9 to 10 frames in a hive. So 4 times, let's say 9 is 36. So if you have a completely full frame box of honey, there's between 30 to 40 pounds of honey in there. So these boxes aren't the lightest. They weigh between 30 and 40, 45 pounds. And when they're on the beehives, there's typically bees in here. So you have to kind of get the bees off. And what we use is basically a product that's called Bee Gone, which is a really smelly substance that the bees don't like. And it basically kind of gets the bees to move away from the places where the honey is, and then we can just carry those off. The next thing we use is a hot knife. As you saw in the previous slides, the bees put a protective coating of wax on over the honey, so you got to cut that off to get to the honey. And then as the slide says here, you put those frames into the extractor and you spin it really fast. And then the honey goes into a food grade bucket before we bottle it. And I'm just going to stop for a second. As a new beekeeper, that metal thing is called the extractor. And you can probably buy those between, I don't know, $200 to thousands of dollars. But a lot of the local bee clubs will rent these to you or let you borrow them. So if you're thinking of getting into beekeeping, figure out where your local bee club is, and they might have one to rent. I know the Cook DuPage Bee Club, which is what you see the extractor here, they have one that you can rent out, or I think, in fact, if you're a member, you can borrow it for free. So I'd highly recommend that as a new beekeeper, that you try to borrow one of these, because it doesn't probably make sense to either go out and purchase one or use one in a different method. And then once the honey comes out, we put into bottles. Grant's going to show you some different bottles here. The smallest bottle is a 6-ounce bottle of honey. Then the larger one's a 1-pounder. And then the back of the screen, those are 2-pound bottles. These are plastic bottles. You can obviously put them in plastic or glass, or you can basically put them in whatever container you want. But you can buy these through the different bee companies, whether it's Daydent or Better Bee, and they can sell you 1 to thousands of these if you want. And then you don't see, but you put a cap on them, and then we sell these. Want to go to the next slide, Grant? And this is what they look like when they're all kind of bottled and labeled up. The one on the left is a 5-pound bottle, a 2-pound bottle, a 1-pound bottle, and then a 6-ounce bottle. In addition to honey, bees also make wax. And when you're extracting the honey, you cut that wax off. And there's several different products you can use the wax for. What you see on the screen here is a wax mold for candles. Grant's holding up the mold itself here. Right now you see the molten wax in there, the molten beeswax in there. And this is what a candle looks like. Grant's holding one up once it's dried. You can also make lip balm, and that's what you see in the picture there. There's a couple other ingredients in the lip balm besides just beeswax. And you can also make lotion. And I think the lotion there says it's olive oil, coconut oil, beeswax, and vitamin E, and some honey. So those are some of the different products that we make with the bee products. Also, for anybody who's kept honey in their house, honey has a tendency to what's called crystallize. And basically it turns very hard and almost solidifies. If that ever happens to you, all you have to do is heat the honey up. It'll uncrystallize. If it's in a plastic bottle, it's a little more difficult than a glass bottle, but in a glass bottle, you can just basically stick it in some warm water. It's roughly 100 degrees to 120 degrees and leave it in there for a while, and it'll kind of melt down, and it'll turn back into regular looking honey. In fact, when we put our honey in those 5-gallon buckets, after a month or two, they typically crystallize, so we need to warm them up before we put them into bottles. I still haven't figured out exactly why the honey crystallizes. Some of our honey will crystallize in a couple weeks, and some will never crystallize. I've been told it might have to do with the types of sugars that are in the honey, whether it's fructose, or I think there's maybe sucrose or other different types of sugars that comprise honey. But again, that's just based on where the bees get their nectar from. So I don't think you have much control over that. I've also noticed maybe the temperature that you keep the honey at affects the crystallizing, but I don't really know what causes it. All I do know is you can always bring the honey back to normal by warming it up. And this is a picture of all the different products that we've made with the honey and then eventually have sold. In terms of selling, we have gone to our local farmers market and sold honey. There's quite a market for local raw natural honey. People really seem to like it. We do take pride in making sure the bottles look nice and are clean. When I took my honey making class, my instructor said, if you're going to sell honey, make sure you clean the bottles up. Don't have any honey on there. Don't have them be sticky. So we do our best to make the product look very nice and appealing. And Grant's now going to go over some fun honeybee facts.
Okay. First one, it takes 1 ounce of honey to fuel a bee to fly around the world. To buy 3 pounds of bees, you'll get 10,001 bees. And bees can't fly in the rain. And bees can fly 1.5 miles away from the hive. And also, since it says 1 ounce honey could fuel a bee to fly around the world, they couldn't fly around the world since they can only fly 1.5 miles away from the hive. Honey never spoils. They found honey in an Egyptian tomb that was still edible. And then, does anyone have any questions?
So that concludes our formal presentation. We haven't been monitoring the chat box, so maybe Grant
Yeah, I
can pull that up here, and we'll
Yeah, I can.
we'll
do
start
that.
out by reading the questions we have. And then I'm not sure if people will be able to ask questions live, but let's first pull up the two Q&A. I see there's 2 questions
Yeah,
here.
I need to stop the share.
Okay,
This doesn't show my mouse.
so now I can get those questions up there.
Okay. So in the Q&A, there's.
Okay, so the first question is how much sugar and how much water? Very good question. In the spring, you use what's called a light honey water, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio on a weight basis. And we think here, so I think there are, if you're using a volume basis, I think there are each, let me think here. Well, I'm gonna get it wrong, whatever I say, but sugar or water has twice the density of the other. So it's either 2 cups of sugar and 1 cup of water, or 1 cup of sugar and 2 cups of water. But basically what you're doing is putting a 1-to-1 weight basis on. In the spring, I'm sorry, in the late summer, or I'm sorry, late fall and winter, you put a heavier dose of sugar in, so 2-to-1. So you do 2 pounds of honey, I'm sorry, 2 pounds of sugar per 1 pound of water. Again, I would just Google this, and there's information on that. But basically, use a light sugar water in the spring and a heavy sugar water in the fall. The next question is, how much are the bees? A very good question. The bees themselves, when you buy that box of roughly 10,000 bees, that can range anywhere from about $130 to maybe $200. When I buy them, I think the gentleman I buy them from in Wayne, I think he charges between $130 and $140 per box. But if you buy them through the different bee catalogs, I think they're a little more expensive. Or if you buy them, I think I've heard Farm and Fleet sells the beehives or sells the bees, and I think they might sell them closer to $200. So anywhere between 100 and probably 30 to 180 is what it costs. You can also just buy the queen. Sometimes if we have a hive where the queen has died, we'll just buy a queen, and you can buy a separate queen for about, I don't know, $30 to $40. And then the next question here, and I'm going to comment on the beehives themselves. If you buy a fully assembled beehive, like I did from the gentleman in Wayne, I think they're about $400 a piece. And that gives you everything basically you need in terms of the beehive itself. You still also need to buy bee suits and some of the bee equipment. So you're probably looking at a couple $100 more for that. So all in as a new beekeeper, if you wanted 1 beehive, all assembled, you're probably talking about $400 for the hive. And then probably, I don't know, maybe $100 to $300 to buy a bee suit and to buy some of the tools that you need to check the bees, whether it's a bee smoker. There's a special tool called a hive tool that you use to kind of open up the beehive boxes. You would want to buy a smoker, and those are between $30 and $50. So that's kind of some rough numbers on the beehives themselves. The next question is, do you need a permit or license to sell the honey? Fortunately, in Illinois, you don't. I think if you produce less than 10,000 pounds of honey in a year, you don't need any type of license or permit. And that's not the same across different states. I know Indiana, and I think for sure Michigan have different rules on that. So we're somewhat fortunate in Illinois here that you don't have to have a permit to either have, well, I shouldn't say that. Each municipality might be different to have bees, but to sell the bees, to sell the honey in Illinois, you don't have to have a license or permit. The one thing I will say is you are required in Illinois to register your beehives with the, let's see, it's IDNR, so the Illinois Department, I think, of Natural Resources. It's a no-cost application. It's just basically a 1-page form you fill out where you provide your name, address, and the location and number of beehives a location where the beehives are. And I don't know exactly what they do with that information, but I think it can be used so that if there's going to be people spraying pesticides in the area, in theory, they might notify you. I've never been notified, but I do my best to keep that up to date. And like I said, it's a very simple process. There's no fee. And then every year after you've registered them, they send you a letter asking if you still have the same number of beehives and where they are. Next question. Great presentation. Very informative. I have a large garden. Have you noticed? Yeah, we actually had a large garden too. We used to have about 20 or so tomato plants and other things that we grew. And the quick answer is no. The bees, as Grant said, fly about 1.5 mile radius from the beehives. So, and they probably visit thousands, if not tens of thousands of different trees and plants. So I did not notice anything different in our garden. So I don't necessarily know if you would, but just having a beehive. Also, while the bees do get some of their nectar from just regular plants and flowers, I think most of their nectar comes from trees that are blossoming in the spring. So while it doesn't hurt to plant a few flowering plants around your beehive, that's definitely not going to sustain them to produce hundreds of pounds of honey. But yeah, if you have apple trees and produce trees, I would say those do need bees to pollinate, so it wouldn't hurt. And we actually had, I think, we had 2 apple trees in our front yard, and I'm not really sure if we saw much of a noticeable difference when the beehives were there, but I don't think it would hurt. And the next question is, how far from your house should you keep your hives? It's probably a better question is, how far should you keep the beehives from your neighbors' houses? But you could have the beehives literally right out your back door. I would say you want to basically have the bees probably about 10 to 15 feet from basically where you would typically walk. But the bees, once they fly out of the hives, disperse very, very quickly. I think I've been told places in Chicago, I think it's by the Art Institute or Maggie Daley Park or Millennium Park there. They have some beehives that are just right next to the sidewalk, I think behind a hedgerow. And you wouldn't even know they're there. So you can have them very close to your house. I think in our case here, we had them on the side of our garage, and we had a basketball hoop in the driveway, and they were less than probably, I don't know, 10 feet from where we'd play basketball, and they never really bothered us or caused any concerns. The next is, how much honey did you have to sell before you recouped your initial investment? That's a good question. You can probably sell the honey anywhere from between $5 to, I don't know, upwards of $15 a pound, depending how good your marketing operation is, I guess. So let's say you sell it for $10 a pound and you produce 100 pounds of honey. Basically, you'd gross $1,000 from that one beehive. So if it costs roughly between, I don't know, $400 to $600 to get your first beehive, typically in the first year, you're not going to produce any excess honey. But by year 2, you could easily start producing 100 pounds of honey. So by year 2, if things go well, you could recoup your investment. That's obviously in a good situation. We were very fortunate. Our first couple years, we didn't have many of our beehives die, and we produced a lot of honey. So we recouped our investment probably after a couple of years. But talking with other new beekeepers, I don't think everybody's that fortunate and that lucky. I think a lot of people have their hives completely die in the first year, so you had to start over the second year. I will say, yes, while we had some luck, I would like to say some of it was skill, and part of that was taking the right beekeeping class. I was, like I said, very fortunate to take a class from a very experienced, knowledgeable beekeeper who basically showed you exactly what to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why we did have success in the first couple of years. For some reason, I have noticed as time goes on, I would have thought each subsequent year I would get better and better, but it's been actually the opposite. I feel like every year we produce a little less honey per hive than the previous year on average. I'm not sure why that is. In fact, last year with COVID, we had a lot more time on our hands. So we spent a lot more time visiting the beehives. And last year was the worst year we had in producing honey. Some of my theories are maybe there's been some pesticides or some diseases that have built up in the beehives, and that's hindered their production. But to be honest, I don't really know. Every year you start out thinking you're going to produce a lot of honey or want to produce more than the last year, and then it never seems to always work that way. So we'll see what happens this year. The next question is, how are the bees in farmland? How do bees do in farmland with corn and bean crops? Yeah, very good question. We have not had beehives out in more the rural areas, but what I've been told is beehives actually don't do that well in a monoculture area, specifically like corn. I've been told that beehives don't do well in cornfields because there's not a whole lot of variety out there. I don't really know if corn pollen is what bees need. I have been told that soybeans and beans are good for honeybees. You might need to do some more research on that. But if it's just a cornfield, I've been told that's not the best for beehives. But other crops, I think are. I don't think there's a lot of alfalfa grown in this area, but I think alfalfa and maybe some of those other types of crops actually are good for producing honey. Maybe you visit. Well, then the question is, maybe you visited too often during COVID and stressed the bees. That is definitely a possibility, or I don't know, maybe they can get COVID. I see you're a doctor. I'm sure that's not the case, but no, I think you could be exactly right. Sometimes if you overvisit them, that could be a problem. But to be honest, I don't think that was the case. We weren't there daily. We were there maybe every week versus typically I'd be there every 2 weeks. One of the things I did do differently this year, I instead of having 10 frames in the brood boxes, I converted to 9. A more experienced beekeeper recommended that I do that. And that's really the only change that I made. So obviously this year I'm going back to 10, but I don't really know if that's the reason. Next question is, what are some common mistakes, pitfalls to avoid during your first year? Let me think about that. I think one common mistake is overly worrying. Just because you don't see a lot of bees and a lot of new eggs right away, don't get alarmed from day one. I'm trying to think of any pitfalls that, like I said, I was very fortunate. I took a class from somebody who kind of gave us a lot of guidance. So I'd like to think we didn't really, in those first couple of years, I wouldn't have done a whole lot different. I think one of the pitfalls is just thinking you're not being careful enough. I think you almost have to try it sometimes to mess up the bees. So I think don't worry so much and just kind of let the bees do their thing. And where can we buy your honey? You can buy the honey, actually Google Facebook 6th Avenue Honey. And my wife handles all the marketing and sales of the honey. But Google, like I said, we have a Facebook page that's called 6th Avenue Honey. Just send a message there and you can ask if you'd like to buy some. She can let you know where.
6th Avenue Honey at gmail.com.
I guess there's also an email, 6th Avenue Honey at gmail.com. So
uppercase S-A-H.
Yeah, so SIXTH Avenue Honey at gmail.com. And we've just sold it off our front porch typically. Somebody commented that alfalfa is grown in Illinois, but typically cut and baled before. Yeah, I think that's probably, I'm sure you're right there. So any more questions here? I don't know if we can answer any live questions or not. I think this is supposed to end at 8, so I think we're probably about out of time here. And Grant and I are both big University of Illinois basketball fans, and there's a game that starts at 8, so we're looking forward to watching that pretty soon here. So I don't know, is there any way to open it up to Q&A? I haven't heard anything. Oh, one more. Oh, could you say the name of the teacher? Yeah, his name is Chuck Chuck Lawrence. I don't think it's L-A, I think it's Lorance. And right now, I think he's only teaching a class out somewhere in Kane County. I think he's teaching it somewhere on Peck Road. So Google maybe the Kane County or St. Charles or Kane County Beekeepers, Chuck Lawrence. Like I said, he used to do one in Wheaton, but I think with COVID, things are a little bit different this year. So I'm actually not sure exactly how they're doing it. But and Chuck, I think, is 78 this year. So I think maybe he's cutting back a little bit. But yeah, I'd highly recommend. And the class is probably already started. I think I took my class. It started it went January, February, and March, because typically you start getting your bees in about end of March or early April. But yeah, Google Chuck Lawrence. He and his wife have been doing honeybees for a long, long time, and he's definitely the guy to reach out to. So without any other questions, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you for attending tonight. Hope you learned a little bit about honeybees. We've had a fun time doing it, and would highly recommend giving it a try. I guess I should comment, I know some towns have local ordinances and rules and regulations on either how many beehives you can have, where you can put them, and even if you can have beehives. So we had our beehives in LaGrange, and in our research, there weren't really any rules or regulations other than you obviously want to be a good neighbor. But before you get too far into it, make sure you do a little bit of research on what's allowed in your local community. So with that, I think we'll wrap things up. I'm not sure if the library, if you need to say anything to wrap things up here.
I just want to say thank you to you, Grant, and also sorry, Grant, for getting your age wrong. We had it written wrongly in our advertisements. I'm so sorry, but you guys gave a wonderful presentation. It was so informative. I loved it. I thought it was really great. Actually, my friend just got into beekeeping, and I was going to send her this video because she wasn't able to be here tonight. And so thank you guys for this presentation because it's pretty helpful. A lot of people are into beekeeping these days.
Well, thank you for having us.
I hope everyone has a good night and come back for more library programs. Thank you.